Hi, welcome to the Firestarters webcast. My name is Steve Scheier. I'm a cannabis leadership cultivator, author, and speaker, and I'm on a mission to connect you to some of the most remarkable and creative people in cannabis and in hemp. Our guest today is Jodi Green. Jodi, really wonderful to see you.
Thanks for having me, Steve. Pleasure
It's
to be
really
here.
great pleasure. Thank you so much. So, Jodi, you're an attorney, and you've been working in cannabis for some number of years. And I'm thrilled to have you on the show. And perhaps you can start off by telling us what's the state of cannabis in California? What is going on?
That's always a good question. Sometimes we don't know what's going on, and it's going all sorts of different directions, which is why I find this area of law to be so interesting, right? Because we have to pivot all the time. But so the current state of cannabis in California is we are recreationally and medically legal. So, that, in my opinion, is a good start. One of the new things that I'm looking into and helping businesses with or considering is consumption lounges. So, there's certain localities are allowing on-premise consumption, and that's something that we're looking at in the near future.
Yeah, and you're an attorney at Miller Nash.
Yep.
And can you talk a little bit about Miller Nash's perspective on cannabis and what the practice is like?
Sure. Yeah, so I joined Miller Nash about 8 months ago from a firm where I was doing something very different, insurance coverage for insurance companies, super niche area of law. But while I was doing that, I was writing and speaking a lot on cannabis-related issues. I specifically found Miller Nash because it had a robust cannabis group and a lot of women leaders within the firm. And so it is an incredible place to be, to work. We have great clients in all industry verticals, mostly up and down the Pacific Northwest and California.
Wonderful. So let's talk about your origin story in cannabis. Everybody has an origin story. You grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, as I told you earlier, one of my favorite towns. So what is your origin story in cannabis? How did you get to be where you are today?
Such a good question. And it's always a long and winding road, isn't it? Right?
And if you feel like singing it, please feel free.
No singing necessary. But, rein me in if I'm going off on a tangent. I think what I'll say is that I find that, cannabis, like many other things in life, it melds a bit of the personal and professional. From a personal standpoint, I've always been curious about the plant. And its properties, its healing properties. When I became an attorney, I remember saying to myself, this isn't something I'm ever going to be able to work with. And shockingly enough, here we are, right?
Right.
And I love that I find myself in this place where I'm able to meld something that I care deeply about with my professional life. And maybe just to segue or step back a second, from my original legal career as an insurance coverage lawyer, the way that I found myself into cannabis professionally was in speaking about the coverage gaps and the problems faced by companies within the cannabis industry in trying to get insurance. If you ask anybody within the industry now, they'll tell you it's a struggle, that premiums are high, that the forms are not consistent. So it makes it very hard to understand what the coverage is that a company is getting and what it should get or what's going to be excluded. So I just decided I was going to make that my soapbox to jump on and try to educate everybody from, both within the industry, right, within the cannabis industry, companies and policyholders, to actually the insurers that are providing the insurance. Because if everyone isn't on the same page, we're never going to, move forward.
Right. Right. And so what are some of the problems you solve for your cannabis clients? What are the things that you would, if you had advice to give on the top 3 things to not do or the top 3 things to do? I mean, we could do an entire hour-long show on that, I'm sure.
We sure could. I think, from my standpoint, and certainly coming from the insurance background, it's risk management, and I think that in some respects, there are parts of the cannabis industry that really need to get up to pace with what, traditional, if you will, right, traditional conservative industries are doing, having all of the compliance upfront, all of the risk management, the training of employees, and understanding what insurance can and can't do for a company, along with the other belts and suspenders from a legal standpoint, which is making sure that, there are contractual indemnity arrangements that are appropriate with suppliers and other companies, right? And so it's a lot of moving parts.
One of the things that I, as you know, Jodi, and as our listeners and viewers, I wrote this book last year called Power Up. It's all about for cannabis leaders. And one of the things that I've certainly seen in my experience in my 4 years of cannabis is that people are often concerned about how to lead their company, how to make it effective. Have you seen the same, or am I just seeing people that are particularly fall in that category? What is the organizational struggles that you see?
No, I don't think you're alone in that. And I think that's true of every business, actually, in certain respects, right? It's difficult to meld, certainly from a legal perspective, particularly in the startup world or in the entrepreneurial space, which many of the people in the cannabis industry are. And I think that lends itself to the problem is really getting all the front end compliance and risk management and all of those tools in place, right, when in fact the company's mission at the outset is usually, how do we make the most money, right? And so usually the money wants to go into places like product development or marketing. And so it can be a real challenge to convince industry leaders to take the time and expense to go through all of these, what, seem like not very sexy things. How do we get our insurance in place? How do we get our contracts in place? Make sure we're in compliance with all the laws and conflicting regulations, right? And that's why cannabis is so hard. You have this patchwork of conflicting state, local and federal regulations. It might change on an instant, right? So it's so hard to get all those ducks in a row.
Do you think that the state regulations are becoming easier to understand? Or is there, it's always an organic process. Having worked in the state legislature on the Assembly Ways and Means Committee staff, there's always a tail bill. There's always something that happens to better clarify. Is the governing body trying to clarify? Is it trying to simplify?
Man, that's a loaded question, but you understand. You clearly understand.
No, I'm not meaning to. You can give me a secret signal or something.
Oh, no. I think the answer to that, I hope, is yes, but in some respects, no. It's sort of like the circular thing where we sort of, everyone is hoping to do the best thing, and somehow we just find ourselves back where we started. I would like to think that as each new state legalizes, they will learn from the mistakes of the past. And there's always new rulemaking and new legislation coming into play, right? Even in states that have been doing it for a long time. So right now, California is going through some changes within its structure of the Department of Cannabis Control. We are through the LA County Bar Association, which I'm a member of, we're going through and working through the new regulations, trying to work with business owners and make sure that, they make sense from a practical business standpoint, which is really what you need. You can't have regulations that are so difficult to comply with that it just runs everybody out of the industry, or they're going to move to a new state, which is the problem we continue to see with California, unfortunately.
Right. For sure, absolutely. Yeah, it's a very tricky situation. I think there are many things come to bear. There are people who do not want cannabis, and so they try to make it as difficult as possible. There are people who do, but they're trying to balance off it. Having been on the assembly staff, I have some insight into how this works, and it's very complicated. There are, as you very well know, how many counties in the state have opted out? Is it like 45 or?
I don't recall the number, but it's a lot.
It's a lot.
And that makes it very hard for companies in the state to make money. There's a very limited number of licenses. It's extremely competitive. So it's not easy to do business and to make money here. As much as everyone thinks that cannabis is a cash cow, it's not. It's not that simple. There's a lot of nuance to it.
Right. Now, one of the things that both you and I are very interested in is promoting women in cannabis. In fact, I'm doing a special Firestarters show next week, I believe, with 4 women cannabis entrepreneurs, and we're going to be talking about that subject. So, do you have a point of view about what we can do to increase the number of women in cannabis? Or I know you're in various women's networking groups. Mm-hmm. What do you and they think should happen?
A couple of questions there. I'll try to unpack.
Please.
I think that's awesome. I love that you're promoting women leaders in the space. It's, cannabis and probably like a lot of other industries is, kind of an old boys club in some respects. And so it's just getting out of that model and teaching women leaders that they can be authentic and that they can be themselves. They can bring themselves to the table. And that's important for a few reasons. First of all, it's important really just to create collaboration and creativity, right?
Right.
You're bringing a totally different viewpoint as a woman than as a man. And we have leadership styles that differ, and we have stories that differ. And, a large portion of the consumer market are women, right? And so you have to think of that too from a business standpoint. It certainly behooves companies to include women within their ranks so that we can really bring that side of the coin to the table.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's critically important. And like anything else, unless it's specifically addressed, nothing ever really happens. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to our show we're going to be doing with Myrna Gillis of Aqualitis, Lisa Hurwitz of Happy, Autumn Shelton of Autumn Brands, and I am going to kill myself because I can't remember the 4th person. But
I didn't answer part of your question, which was, what can we really do? One thing is being authentic, right, and showing our real selves as women. But the other thing is, I think being part of industry groups, really bringing women together, and I think what you're doing is great. And I'm going to be speaking on a panel at the DRI Cannabis Conference later this year about women leaders in cannabis as well. And so I think that really just showing up and being there for each other, promoting one another is really key to success.
Yeah, I think it's really essential. I also think it's important that people, the women in particular, really everyone, but women in particular, step into their power and understand that they own their power, and they do have the power to be a success in this industry. This industry is not needs them, and it needs their creativity, it needs their gumption, and it really needs to happen.
100%. Could not have said it better.
There you go. So in our closing moments, we wanted to talk a little bit about psychedelics. I know that you really have a strong interest in that, and while we don't very often get in this webcast series into psychedelics, I'm really curious to see your take on what's going to happen in psychedelics in California.
Well, I think I can talk generally about psychedelics and what's happening nationally, and then maybe drill down locally a little bit. So I think we are in the midst of a revolution of sorts. And what's driven me as a lawyer and as a person, I think throughout everything that I do, is really just pushing the boundaries, right? Pushing the limits of what society views as okay. And certainly when you look at the research surrounding psychedelics, and when I use that word, it refers to a category of many different substances, from psilocybin, which is going to soon be legal in Oregon, to things like MDMA and other substances that have been used historically, for spiritual use by indigenous peoples for many, many years. Mm-hmm. But there have been tremendous research studies showing the clinical benefits of use of certain psychedelics for things like treatment-resistant depression and substance use disorders. So that is incredible. And those clinical trials are going through the FDA, right, with FDA approval, notwithstanding the fact that these drugs remain on Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substances Act. As far as the state of where I think California might go, right now, all eyes are on Oregon, which recently passed legislation that's going to go into effect in January of 2023, where they will be legalizing and licensing companies to administer psilocybin specifically in a clinical setting. So I think the future for California will probably depend on how things roll out with Oregon. There has been legislation proposed over the last year and a half that
Right.
has been sitting on the table and hasn't been touched. And I expect that, people within California will be watching Oregon and really, and as well as the current state of the clinical trials, right, that I talked about, and see how things stand after that.
It's a very exciting time to be alive, and with all of its psychosis and craziness, it's still very, very exciting. So, Jodi, as we conclude our show today, please let people know how they can reach you.
Oh, sure. You can find me on LinkedIn, Jodi Green. You can find me by email. You can find me on Miller Nash, jodi.green@millernash.com. Happy to.
Do you hang out in Instagram land? Do you hang out in?
I am not hanging out on Instagram land, but I'm very active on LinkedIn. So that's probably the easiest way to find me. I'm posting almost every other day on issues that pique my interest, whether it's cannabis, psychedelics, women leadership issues, and everything else in between.
Wonderful. So I'd like to close. Jodi was kind enough to send me cues and views on Jodi Green, which I thought was very awesome. And she has two things in here that I think are great. Number one, she quotes, "What's prominently featured on your home or office wall?" And she says, Theodore Roosevelt's "Man in the Arena" speech. "Who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who knew neither victory nor defeat." That's an excellent thing to have on your wall.
One of my favorite quotes. I can't stop. It gives me chills, actually, every time I hear it, because it is so meaningful, right? It should always be daring greatly.
Yes, absolutely. And then the last one, which is, "What's the best advice you've received in your career?" It's very simple. If it's not a hell yes, it's no. I think that's definitely advice that everyone can use. So, Jodi, thank you very much for being on the show today. Thank you for sharing with us your experiences in cannabis and even psychedelics, and on women in leadership. And we wish you nothing but the best. And thank you again for being on the show.
Thank you, Steve. And I'll just end it by saying, when you asked me to be on the show, it was a hell yes for me. So that's why.
Oh, you're the best.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. Love chatting with you today.
Absolutely. You take care.